What if $60 billion of your country's wealth vanished and no one told you? What if the proof sat quietly for years in a schoolteacher's drawer while foreign CEOs flew private jets, built mansions, and shook hands in boardrooms they never intended to share with the people whose land they exploited? And what if one quiet morning a retired village teacher walked into a five-star hotel with a yellow folder in her hand and rewrote the fate of a nation without ever raising her voice? This is not a parable. This is not a movie. This is Burkina Faso. And this is the day the silence ended. It started with a woman named Aïcha Dembele, a teacher, a widow, a sister, to a man who died trying to speak the truth. Her story didn't begin with power but with principle. What she carried wasn't a weapon but a document. What she faced wasn't an army but a system so well-dressed it forgot its own crimes. And when she stood beside President IBRAHIM Traoré, she reminded the world of something it desperately tries to forget. Justice doesn't always shout it, sometimes whispers. You're about to hear a story that powerful people prayed would never reach your ears. A story about one country's stolen treasure and how they took it back with nothing but paper principle and a pen. Do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective yet? Or is this just the beginning of something even bigger? If you believe dignity is more important than diplomacy, if you believe stolen voices deserve to be heard, please comment where in the world you're listening from. Share this story with someone who still believes justice can't win, and subscribe if you know the truth should never stay buried. It didn't begin with a press conference. It didn't begin with a breaking headline. It began in the red dust village of Sapane behind a schoolhouse where children were learning how to plant cassava. Aïcha Dembele had spent her life teaching children how to count. She never imagined she'd be the one to help a nation reclaim what had been stolen from them. That morning, she was in her garden sleeves rolled, guiding a small group of children through the process of planting. Her hands were rough, her back slightly curved with age, but her voice was still steady. One child asked why they spaced the stems apart. She replied without hesitation, "Even roots need room to grow." She didn't know then that her own roots, her family, her country were about to dig deep into a history long buried. A motorbike came through the field carrying a young man wearing a faded brown jacket. It was the same uniform her brother once wore. The man handed her an envelope sealed in wax. "Your brother asked for this before he passed," he said quietly. Inside her small home, she lit a kerosene lamp and opened it. What she found was not a letter. It was a hand-stitched folder wrapped in waxcloth smelling faintly of oil and copper. Inside were 3 pages of notes in her brother's handwriting. Mamadou Dembele, a mine inspector who had vanished months earlier after one ominous phone call. "They're not just digging gold anymore. They're digging graves for our future." The notes listed names, foreign CEOs, warehouse addresses, shipping manifests, and most chillingly red-marked maps of underground tunnels extending from abandoned mines to secret storage depots, some even crossing into neighboring countries. Alongside these maps were annotations tracing gold shipments to offshore accounts in Luxembourg and the British Virgin Islands. One phrase stood out: "If I disappear, you'll know why. Give this to the man in the red beret." She didn't hesitate. She wrapped the folder dressed in the modest wrap she wore to her late husband's funeral and boarded a dusty taxi bound for Ouagadougou. She didn't bring a speech. She didn't bring lawyers. She brought the truth. When she arrived at the presidential compound, President Ibrahim Traoré was already waiting. He did not greet her with ceremony. He greeted her with silence and respect. He understood what the folder meant because in this country, paper has always spoken louder than weapons. That evening, he summoned 3 people: Captain Umar Diarra, his military intelligence chief judge Aminata Coulibaly, one of the nation's sharpest legal minds, and Idris Nabayogo, a financial advisor who had warned years ago about vanishing minerals. Traoré laid the folder before them. They turned each page like archaeologists uncovering bones of a crime long buried. The evidence was staggering: contracts signed with expired authority, seals from colonial eras duplicated to look legal, dummy corporations hiding profits in Europe and Dubai, and a consistent pattern: for every ton of gold recorded, at least 2 others were smuggled out untaxed, untracked, unspoken. Judge Aminata held a document to the light. "This signature," she said, "belongs to a man who was convicted of embezzlement before the ink even dried." Idris calculated losses not just in gold, but in education, infrastructure, environmental ruin. Captain Umar clenched his fist. "Let me shut it all down," he said. But Traoré raised a hand. "Not yet. We move quickly, but we move legally." Then came the turning point. They discovered a 1994 cornerstone agreement signed between a European consortium and a now disgraced Burkina official. That contract had become the basis for 30 years of extractive deals, every one of them now vulnerable. If this document could be invalidated, the entire structure of foreign exploitation would collapse like a house of cards. Traore stood and walked to the window. Children were playing near the fountain, their laughter faint but free. He spoke softly. They didn't take just gold. They took dignity, and they made us beg for the crumbs of what was already ours. The room fell silent not from fear, but from resolve. And as the rain began to patter against the palace roof, a new kind of storm was forming. The storm didn't begin with thunder. It began with footsteps. On the morning of the International Mining Summit in Ouagadougou, the lobby of the Horizon Continental Hotel glowed with glass chandeliers, foreign flags, and champagne glasses. Executives from across Europe and the Gulf gathered, expecting another year of unchecked profit and polite applause. They didn't expect him. At precisely 10:00 a.m., the double doors opened not ceremoniously, not gently, but like a gavel striking truth. President IBRAHIM Traoré entered the room. No red carpet, no press announcement. Just a man in a plain uniform, a red beret, and beside him the quiet woman from the village Aïcha Dembele holding that same yellow folder. The room froze. Journalists stopped mid-sentence. Executives exchanged anxious glances. Lucien Maro, CEO of Veritas Extraction and architect of many of Burkina Faso's gold contracts, attempted a half-smile. President Traoré, he said, "We didn't expect your attendance today." Traoré didn't return the smile. "I wasn't invited. That's the point." Aïcha handed him the folder. He raised it for all to see. "This," he said, "is a contract signed 30 years ago granting foreign corporations full access to our gold forever for 2% royalties." He turned a page. It bears the signature of a man convicted of corruption before the ink dried. It uses a colonial-era seal. It was never legal. And it ends today. A gasp spread across the room. Cameras clicked. A CEO stood. "You're accusing international corporations of fraud with no legal basis." Traoré didn't blink. "I'm presenting evidence. And while you held meetings in Geneva, our children dug pits with bare hands. You called it partnership. We call it theft." A journalist asked, "Will there be legal action?" Traoré answered calmly, "A case file is open at the African Union Court. Your company's accounts and agents are named. And this," he held the folder higher, "is your invitation to finally meet the law." He handed the folder to a soldier who passed it to a journalist in the front row. "Let the people see what silence looks like on paper." And with that, he turned and walked out. That was the public rupture. But behind closed doors, the reaction came fast and sharp. First, from Washington, a diplomat arrived in a tinted SUV requesting a quiet conversation. Inside the ministry lounge, he offered development packages, military cooperation, and finally discreet cash support labeled as a stabilization fund. The answer was simple. "We're not for sale." Not anymore. Then came France. Their envoy stormed into the Ministry of Commerce. "This is economic sabotage," she snapped. "We will suspend trade. We will freeze assets." The minister didn't flinch. "You should be grateful we're using words instead of force." Emails from Brussels followed. Unilateral confiscation, breach of trade agreements, risk to European investors. But Burkina Faso didn't back down. They responded with legal citations, evidence, and something the West wasn't used to seeing from Africa: confidence. Inside the compound, Traoré's cabinet was under pressure. Imports stalled. Banks delayed transactions. Some advisors urged caution, pause the audit, reassure investors, wait for things to cool down. But Traoré didn't yield. "Let them threaten," he said during a midnight meeting. "We will not trade gold for silence." Out in the countryside, word spread fast. In Saponay, Aïcha returned to her village. At the town square, elders asked, "Will we suffer?" Young men asked, "Will we be punished?" She stood beneath the neem tree and spoke plainly. "They say we'll starve if we don't obey. But we lived before they came. We'll live after they leave. We are not their clients. We are the soil." A young boy raised his fist. "Foro freedom." The chant rippled through the village. Back in the capital, a note arrived for Traoré. Handwritten from Saponay, it read, "We stand even if hungry." He folded it gently and placed it next to the growing stack of legal threats on his desk. But it wasn't just threats coming in. Across Africa, support ignited. AU delegates called for emergency sessions. Kenyan professors praised the legal precedent. Tanzanian judges cited Burkina Faso in op-eds. In the streets of Bamako, Accra, and Dakar, students marched carrying signs, "We are not for sale." Still, Traore knew the real test wasn't words, it was action. He walked into the National Press Office. No speechwriters, no teleprompter, just one message. We are not anti-West. We are anti-theft. We welcome trade, but not under threat. We welcome partners, but not masters. The message spread within hours, across West Africa, across diasporas in London and Atlanta, across newsrooms in Nairobi and Brussels, and then he signed the order. Executive Order 042, immediate suspension of foreign mineral exports pending legal audit. Within minutes, trucks were halted at borders, helicopters grounded, mining operations frozen, security checkpoints lit up. One truck marked with fake medical aid was opened. Inside, raw gold. The driver was arrested. By nightfall, over 70 trucks sat in silence at southern borders. Some drivers waived permits. Some made panicked phone calls. But the order stood. The next morning, the headlines changed. Burkina Faso freezes, gold trade, Traore defies IMF. Is this Africa's economic rebellion? But inside the country, a deeper transformation was underway. In classrooms, teachers explained the audit to children. In village markets, people bartered food and said, "We'll manage." In city squares, drummers played slow rhythms and whispered, "The soil is speaking." For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso wasn't retreating from crisis. It was creating one on purpose. A controlled disruption, a righteous pause, and above it all, one voice repeating, "They didn't come with tanks. They came with contracts. And we are tearing them apart clause by clause." The gold stopped, but the people didn't. Across Burkina Faso, life shifted in small seismic ways, the kind you don't see in headlines but in habits. The silence that once filled rural clinics, underpaid classrooms, and neglected villages began to lift not with fanfare but with function. In the capital government, ministers faced the gravity of sanctions. Fuel shipments were delayed. Medicine supplies ran thin. Some cabinet members panicked. A few suggested compromise. One whispered, "Just release a portion of the gold, just enough to ease the pressure." President Traore looked at him calm but firm. "You don't ease a cancer, you remove it." But not everyone shared his resolve. Opposition voices resurfaced. Some media outlets backed by foreign advertising warned of economic collapse. Urban elites called for negotiations. "You're risking everything," they said. Traore replied, "We've already lost everything once. We're just taking it back." In the countryside, the mood was different. People organized themselves. Villagers in Toma dug communal wells. Teachers in Kaya taught students about extractive economics using chalk and chalkboards. Old women in Zinyaré formed a rotating food fund to support regions hardest hit by supply chain freezes. Mothers planted emergency crops, cassava, yam, beans, just in case, they said, but also just because it's ours. In Sapone, Aïcha Dembele stood once again under the neem tree, this time speaking to a crowd of farmers, widows, and boys with calloused hands. "They say we're collapsing," she said, "but I see gardens returning. I see children learning. I see silence breaking." Then she held up a notebook and said, "We used to dig for gold. Now we're digging for truth." People didn't cheer, they nodded, a slow nod of understanding, the kind that says we've been hungry before, but never like this. This hunger has a purpose. Meanwhile, politically, the government took bold steps. Judge Aminata Coulibaly announced a full audit of every mining site since 1985. Contracts were subpoenaed. Foreign companies were ordered to submit original documents for verification. Several ministers previously untouched were placed under investigation for collusion. A former trade director fled to Senegal. Interpol issued a warrant. Captain Umar Diarra, working quietly behind the scenes, uncovered a secret trail of shipping logs, some labeled humanitarian, that led to a compound near the border claiming to be a children's shelter. It wasn't. What he found inside were crates of gold dust disguised under aid packages, and worse, small beds drawings, broken toys, notebooks with only first names. A trafficking operation hidden under the banner of charity. He returned to the capital with evidence in hand. He didn't speak. He simply placed it on the president's desk. Traore's jaw tightened. "This is no longer just about money," he said. "This is about the soul of this country." That night, he revoked licenses of 17 NGOs. He created a new office for extraction oversight, placing Amanata at its head. All contracts were now subject to public review. No signature without citizen audit. No handshake without transparency. The civil response was unprecedented. Women marched not to protest, but to deliver cassava to government buildings, chanting, "Feed those who defend us." Fishermen offered free delivery of dried fish to hospitals. Students volunteered as legal interns to help sort the overwhelming paperwork. In the mosques and churches, prayers shifted. They no longer begged for relief. They asked for resolve. In one village, elders hosted a symbolic tribunal, children dressed as judges. Each read the name of a mining company followed by what it had stolen: gold, water, childhood, hope. Then they declared, "We find the people innocent. We find the system guilty." In government halls, that moment echoed louder than any protest. And as Traore signed Executive Order 043, creating a constitutional amendment that declared all natural resources property of the people, a quiet realization swept the country. This wasn't just about economics. It wasn't just about contracts or courts. It was about identity, about reclaiming not only what was stolen, but who they had been taught to forget they were. No one cheered in the streets. Instead, they planted trees, they lit candles, they stood in silence shoulder to shoulder. Burkina Faso wasn't collapsing. It was rebuilding. And this time, the foundation wasn't foreign aid. It was dignity. The world did not clap. It calculated. In Washington, officials watched the freeze in Burkina Faso with quiet alarm. A small, landlocked nation had just pulled off what even resource-rich countries feared to attempt: a full-scale rejection of the global extraction order. The U.S. State Department issued a muted statement urging dialogue and respect for bilateral agreements. But behind closed doors, meetings multiplied. The question wasn't why Burkina Faso acted, it was what happens if others follow. Africa was watching. So was Latin America. So was Haiti. In Brussels, the tone was harsher. The European Economic Bloc threatened sanctions, bank suspensions, and investment blacklisting. But when Burkina Faso responded with legal documentation and citations from the International Court of Justice, the bloc hesitated. "They've outmaneuvered us legally," one EU trade official was overheard saying. "This isn't rebellion, it's litigation." Media reactions split down familiar lines. Some Western outlets labeled it economic suicide and authoritarian nationalism. But across Africa and in parts of Latin America, Traore was hailed as the first president to weaponize law instead of violence. The United Nations called an emergency session after Burkina Faso submitted thousands of pages of evidence. A rare wave of support followed. Ghana called for a pan-African audit initiative. Algeria proposed a continental sovereign resource policy. South Africa offered legal assistance to nations facing similar contract fraud. And quietly, something shifted. In New York, a senior legal consultant to the UN Development Program remarked, "This isn't anti-West, it's post-colonial maturity, and we weren't ready for it." American civil society groups took note too. Some compared Traore's stand to the early years of the American Revolution, a government rejecting the extraction of its wealth by external powers without representation or return. One retired U.S. diplomat put it plainly, "This isn't about Burkina Faso. It's about the end of the old game." Burkina Faso, once treated as a footnote, had become a footstep, and the world, especially its former masters, heard it loud and clear. There were no fireworks, no marching bands, no televised parades, just one old folder, one amendment, one museum. 6 months after the first gold shipment returned, the people of Burkina Faso did not celebrate with noise. They built a room, a small wing in the National Museum, walls painted in the color of the land, deep red, warm brown. And at its center, the yellow folder, not encased in gold, not hidden behind velvet rope, just protected by glass, so that every child who visited could see what dignity looks like when written down. A sign beneath the case read, "One teacher, one letter, one nation reborn." Aïcha Dembele stood beside it wearing the same wrap, the same sandals. She didn't give speeches, she didn't ask for praise. She simply placed her hand on the glass, her fingers trembling slightly. When asked what it meant, she said softly, "It means we lasted longer than their lies." And that perhaps is the true victory. Not the gold, not even the justice, but the memory, the knowing. That dignity is not something given, it's something remembered. Burkina Faso reminded the world that some wars are not fought with guns. They're fought with pages, with patience, with the refusal to disappear. And so we ask you now, do you believe other nations could do what Burkina Faso did? Can we as Americans still recognize the courage of those who fight silently, legally, and with integrity? Was Traoré's revolution not one of violence, but of principle? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this story with someone who still believes justice only comes from power. Subscribe if you know that sometimes the quietest voices rewrite history. Because Burkina Faso didn't just recover its gold, it recovered its name. And maybe, just maybe, it reminded the rest of us that we can too.